Hello, and welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast in Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, Executive Editor of TNSR. In the most recent issue of Texas National Security Review, we feature a strategist article by Dan Mahanty and Sahr Muhammedally about the question of civilian casualties in major war. This topic, of course, has assumed dramatic importance as the world watches in horror the Russian campaign in Ukraine. But this is hardly a new phenomenon. When one takes a look at the campaigns fought in Syria and Iraq to expel the Islamic State, as well as other campaigns where the tools of modern war encounter the concentrated populations of modern life. Here to discuss this issue today are the authors of that article, and I'll ask you guys to introduce yourselves. Sahr, would you begin?
Thanks so much, Doyle. My name is Sahr Muhammedally. I'm the director for our Middle East and South Asia program at the Center for Civilians in Conflict, where I work on engaging and advising armed actors and governments on civilian protection and on urban war issues.
Excellent. Dan?
Yeah, hi, Doyle. It's a pleasure to be here and great to be here with my colleagues for many years. My name is Dan Mahanty, as you said. I'm the director of the Research, Learning, and Innovation Unit at the Center for Civilians in Conflict. I oversee our Research, Learning, and Innovation Unit, and I have the privilege of managing a team of really talented advisors and also oversee our research agenda at Civic. So great to be here.
Excellent. Well, if I could just start out by asking you guys, what is the main argument in your article? And Sahr, maybe you could start us off.
Protection of civilians should always be a key strategic goal of any military operation. And we feel very strongly that it's not just limited to counterinsurgency campaigns, but it's applicable in all conflicts, including large-scale combat operations, and it should be integrated into mission planning and preparedness. And Doyle, as you said, we're seeing the daily images of horror coming out of Ukraine. We've seen similar images and scenes coming from Iraq and Syria, where I've spent a lot of time over the last decade or so. Yet there's a lot of talk about future wars being more deadly and devastating if there is an outbreak of war between the United States and Russia or China. We see that an enemy-centric war results in devastating losses of civilian lives and destruction of civilian infrastructure, protracted displacement of civilians, disruption of education, health services, employment. And therefore, it's very critical that the U.S. and its allies should take steps now, while time still allows, to adapt planning and training and tools to better protect civilians in scenarios where they may be fighting in densely populated areas. So that was sort of the main argument of our article.
So I'm curious, because you talk about an enemy-centric war. What is the alternative?
When we use that term in the article, or when others use this term, enemy-centric, of course we can acknowledge that most conflicts involve operations that focus on defeating an adversary. But when we talk about enemy-centric, we're talking about the focus on the enemy sort of obscuring all other political, operational, and strategic factors that might be important in the way you conduct your operations or the way you pursue a campaign. And that myopia, that single sort of focus, we believe can be really destructive when it becomes the primary consideration in war. So I think that's what we mean when we talk about enemy-centric, defeating the enemy at all other costs.
Obviously, this is an issue that has existed for as long as war has existed. We can go back to General Sherman's famous comment that war is cruelty and you cannot refine it further than that. Why has this topic assumed such criticality and such urgency now?
Well, we see that the U.S. and allies are very quick to sort of distinguish themselves from countries like Russia and how it's prosecuting its war in Ukraine. But in the same time, we've also seen officials warning the public that the policies and tactics that were effective at reducing civilian harm during the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan are not legally required or not practical to employ for large-scale wars where the stakes and risk are much higher. And so there's been a lot of talk over the last few years of highly destructive wars that more chaotic, more intense, and again, as Dan was saying, this enemy-centric approach and moving away from this population-centric approach, which was attributed to counterinsurgencies. But I think what we are seeing, this outlook is proving quite short-sighted from both a legal, political, and humanitarian reasons, because it's basically inferring that protecting civilians is impractical or operationally unwise. And I think the recent analysis from the U.S.'s involvement in the operations against Islamic State in Iraq and Syria demonstrate the consequences when you remove safeguards that are meant to reduce civilian harm from operations. And therefore, there's such a need to not view this as difficult, but that more needs to be done to contextualize and adapt to an environment where you're conducting operations amongst the civilian population, and what more needs to be done to reduce the impact on civilians without impairing operational effectiveness.
So I think it might be helpful for some of our listeners if we kind of went through a brief overview of the law that governs armed conflict, especially as it regards protecting civilians. Sahr, can you just give us a thumbnail of that?
From dawn of history to present day, war has brought unspeakable horror, destruction, and suffering of millions of people, combatants and civilians alike. And the law of armed conflict, international humanitarian law, sets out rules that seeks to limit humanitarian consequences of armed conflict, to restrict the means and methods of warfare that parties to a conflict may employ, and ensure the protection and humane treatment of persons who are not or no longer taking direct part in hostilities. And so IHL, or the law of armed conflict, sets minimum standards of humanity that must be respected in any situation of armed conflict. And as our article discusses, the key principles include distinguishing between civilians and combatants, proportionate use of force to minimize incidental loss of life, injury, damage to civilian objects, and that use of force cannot be excessive to the military advantage anticipated. And there is a general obligation to take constant care to spare the civilian population, civilians and civilian objects, and take precautionary measures in assessing the risk to civilians, and to the extent feasible, protect civilians from the effects of attack. So this is sort of the key nuts and bolts, key principles that are applicable and govern the conduct of facilities. Of course, the body of the Geneva Conventions and the law of armed conflict extensive in terms of detainee treatment and et cetera, law of occupation, which we're not going into.
Sure. Now, on the question of constant care in particular, you outlined in the article some ways in which the U.S. takes a policy position that is slightly different, at least in the language, if not in the substance, from what you've just outlined, Sahr. And Dan, I wonder if you could walk us through these policy questions.
So the U.S. military constrains its military operations according to treaties, which are the Geneva Conventions, and customary international law, and as a matter of policy. So the U.S. has ratified the 4 Geneva Conventions, but not Additional Protocol 1 and Additional Protocol 2 that provide rules on conduct of hostilities in international armed conflict, which is state-on-state conflict, like currently Russia, Ukraine, or non-international armed conflict, which is when the U.S. was involved in operations in Afghanistan, or the U.S. was working in support of the Iraqi government in the fight against the Islamic State. But the U.S. has, as a matter of policy, integrated key provisions of Additional Protocol 1 in the Department of Defense Law of War Manual and emphasized the military policies. And the Law of War Manual, for example, states that the standard of what precautions or constant care must be taken is not an absolute requirement to do everything possible. And I think this distinction between legal obligation to protect civilians and policy preference is this ongoing debate about whether some of the good practices that were enacted to minimize civilian harm in the counterinsurgency operations in Iraq and Afghanistan are applicable in future wars in large-scale combat operations.
And why would the United States take a policy exception to something that seems as desirable as protecting civilians? Dan, can you give us some insight there?
Yeah, thanks. It's a really good question. And I think it's important to point out how much faith the U.S. military places in the power of its adherence to international law, or its interpretation of international law, to protect civilians in the conduct of its operations. And then beyond that, really, I think that additional protections are seen as operational constraints. And so it's natural, I think, from the perspective of a warfighter to say, look, I'm already constrained by the rules, and those rules I agree are legitimate, and I have no problem following them. But beyond that, really what I need is the discretion to fight the war in the way that's going to achieve military victory in the shortest amount of time possible with the fewest amount of resources possible. So I think it's not necessarily an impulse or a preference to kill more civilians, not at all. I think it's more a strategic preference to maintain a full range of motion in the conduct of the way wars are fought by the military within a set of certain bounds. And I think that when it comes to interpreting specific elements of the law, the U.S. military and its kind of history of military jurisprudence has a tendency to provide itself with pretty clear instructions as to what's required and what is really a matter of discretion for commanders. And I think this constant care interpretation is a perfect example of this, where as Sahr pointed out, it's not seen as an absolute requirement, but you do what you can within the bounds of feasibility. And I think this is another point we really wanted to make in the article is not to kind of rehash the whether or not something is or should be viewed as an obligation under the law, but rather if the military really wants to focus on feasibility as a limiting factor in how much it can protect civilians, to focus on making protecting civilians more feasible by adopting practices and learning lessons and focusing on the things that can be done while we still have time before the next wars are fought. So I think that's a principal emphasis of the article.
So one line of criticism of an argument in favor of greater constraints is that this effectively makes the military that observes these constraints fight with one hand tied behind their back, and particularly with the likelihood that we are going to face adversaries who will not demonstrate the same level of concern for humanitarian law as the United States historically has. The argument basically runs that the United States places itself at a disadvantage by doing this. And there's also, again, this sort of long historical trend in favor of the idea of a short, sharp war. I mean, this actually even underlied one of the original sets of regulations for the conduct of war, the Lieber Code. Lieber himself was a big proponent of this. So I'm just wondering whether you believe that this is a view with merit or how it is that you view this argument.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to unpack there. And we hear this line of argument, or both lines of argument, relatively frequently. And when you stop to interrogate, the logic a bit, you can kind of start to understand why it's slightly more nuanced than saying, well, we should just relieve ourselves of constraints and win the war as fast as possible. Fewer people will die, at the end of the day. First, when you talk about, why wouldn't we want to relieve ourselves of all constraints in the conduct of warfare? Why wouldn't we want to take the gloves off? I know that's a term that probably not many people want to hear. It's a kind of caricature of what they might, the terminology they might use, but it's basically the same idea. And my response to that would be, the distinguishing characteristic of democracies, of legitimate governments, has always been the self-imposition of constraints on the use of force and on the use of violence. Our police are subject to constraints. Our military is subject to constraints. It's actually what differentiates our security institutions from the security institutions of governments that don't enjoy a public mandate to govern. Now, as I talked about before, the law of war, like the U.S. interpretation of the law of war, does in a way serve the function of those constraints. And provided that the U.S. military abides by those rules, again, it doesn't see necessarily a reason to impose any more constraints. But we also think, and I think we tried to describe this in the article, that can also be a pretty short-sighted view for two reasons. First of all, the power of the laws of war and the law of war program is only so effective. There's a full range of interests served by constraining oneself in the conduct of war that can't be served by the law alone. And so, from our perspective, by focusing both on compliance with law and focusing on this argument that to do anything more is counterproductive, it can be easy to look past the many lessons from history that we've learned about the full range of interests that can actually be served through a modicum of reasonable constraints on the way wars are fought. To go to the second line of argument, this idea, this kind of sharp war idea that, the more intense wars, sharp wars, are shorter. And we've heard this, or a variation of this logic, come out of various official channels over the last couple of years. And I find it really troubling. Number one, because we should actually stop to question whether or not it's actually factually accurate that more intense wars are actually shorter. And I don't think that the historical record bears that out. And number two, again, to go back to this point about the full range of interests served by a modicum of self-restraint or some constraints on the use of force, maybe sometimes the duration of the war is not necessarily the most important factor that we should be considering in our decision to use force. This is not the podcast to relitigate the choice to use the atomic weapon, but I do think that this idea that the ending war quickly should be the only objective served in the way that we think about how to fight wars is a relatively narrow and perhaps unwise logic to pursue.
So if I can pull a couple of these threads together, there is a strain of argument, and we heard this in the debates on, depending on your perspective, torture or enhanced interrogation. We've heard this in a number of other contexts in the war on terror, that the United States needs to never violate the law, but to do everything that is allowed under the law. And so, as you've alluded to, the international law governing armed conflict consists of both treaty law and customary law. The United States abides by many of the treaty provisions as a matter of policy, even if the United States is not a signatory or a party to the treaty. But there's a couple of those reservations, to be concrete about it. Specifically, I'm thinking of anti-personnel landmines and also cluster munitions, where the United States has made the argument that, we have not signed up to the bans on these weapons. They are of critical military utility to the way we fight, and we're going to need to continue to do this. What's your perspective on this from both a legal and a policy perspective? So, Sahr, would you start us out?
Yeah, so for a start, IHL actually is a minimum standard of what is required during conduct of hostilities. And the law is very practical in the sense, or very reasonable, that, there should be it was enacted in 1949 and the protocols came around 1977. But there's a lot of learning, as even if you look from World War II to now, on how various military operations have taken place across the globe. So for law-abiding, ethical warfighters, you'd want to, there is the legal minimum requirement. And again, the law requires and obligates to minimize incidental harm. But there's also the ethics, the honor of soldiers, that is also really important. And in my humble opinion, many soldiers that I have met, in the US or in other countries, they would want to have the most information available about the environment they're operating in, so they don't cause unnecessary suffering. They don't harm civilians and destroy civilian homes. And I think it is incumbent for commanders that, from an operational effective lens, from an ethical lens, and a legal and a strategic lens, that more is learned in terms of what are the best tactics, procedures, policies and training that is required to fight in an environment with the presence of civilians. And I think that, and even looking at munitions effects, a lot of the munitions that were designed, that are currently, that we see around the world, are actually designed for open rural areas, not for fighting in cities, but what can be done to avoid using them, to minimize. And I think that kind of learning and, is so important. So while everything is not spelled out in the law, again, the law is the minimum standard, so much more can be done, looking at past operations, contextualizing your tactics trainings to the kind of operations you want to fight, to be an ethical warfighter.
Yeah, you mentioned the thing about soldiers being motivated by more than the law. There's a wonderful line in a book by Mark Osil called Obeying Orders, where he says something to the effect of, you're far more likely to get the desired result by training your soldiers to ask not what does international law require, but what would an honorable soldier do under these circumstances. So at several points in the article, you allude to the air campaign versus the Islamic State as an example, both of goods and others, when it comes to protection of civilians. And this is a campaign that I know I didn't have a ton of familiarity with, and I think many of our listeners may share in that. So I'm wondering if you could just sort of outline for us sort of the highlights of that, both from what went well and what lessons we need to do better on in future conflicts.
No, good question. Happy to. And, I spent a lot of time examining both these conflicts, both my colleagues and myself, and spending time in country looking at the effects on civilians. In Iraq, the campaign against ISIS was conducted in one of the most densely populated parts of the country, Mosul. There were over 1.5 million people when the campaign began between East and West Mosul. And it was very interesting to see how the coalition worked with Iraqi forces and with some of the elite forces to conduct operations in a densely populated environment where most of the civilians were present. And there were some good practices to restrain the use of firepower in this environment. But as the campaign shifted from attrition to annihilation and it moved from East Mosul to West Mosul, we saw some of the restraints being removed. And there was a lot of air power that was used, a lot of indirect fires that were used. And you saw the scale of destruction in the west part of the city much higher, and the civilian death toll much higher than in the east part of the city. In Raqqa, RAND has done a really good study, really examining in particular U.S. military operations on how expedited approvals for dynamic strikes, where less time was allowed to gather all the intelligence before engaging a target, resulted in civilian harm and also impeded the ability to distinguish between civilians and fighters. And I think in both campaigns, there was challenges in over-reliance of intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets rather than human intelligence. And we know in an urban environment, these ISRs are degraded because of buildings. And so again, in an urban environment, all sorts of information should feed into the targeting cycle to ensure that where the military objective is in proximity to the civilians. And so I think, and there were one of the big challenges in the campaign was there was not proper analysis of pre-strike assessments about, the U.S. military has a procedure where they conduct assessment before engaging a target and then matching it post-strike to see whether the information that led to the targeting process was sufficient enough and what happened afterwards. Were civilians harmed? Was civilian property impacted, and how to integrate that learning efficiently in real time to improve the next phase of the battle. And I think there were a lot of gaps in that. And what is interesting for all of us who work in this area is that some of the good practices and policies that the U.S., for example, had even in dynamic strikes in counterinsurgency campaigns were not sufficiently, for Iraq and Afghanistan, were not sufficiently scaled up and adapted to a dense urban environment, working largely with partner forces. And I think that's a significant gap in transitioning to a different environment. And, those lessons were not adequately integrated, tactics were not adequately scaled up, and therefore you saw some of the challenges and the consequences for civilians in both Raqqa and in Mosul.
It's hard not to take a somewhat skeptical perspective on what took place in both campaigns, just in terms of the effects. And I think there were lessons that had been learned from the prior, several years of operations, but maybe the wrong lessons in as far as, attempting to reduce the amount of risk that U.S. forces were exposed to and attempting to do a lot of the fighting through partnered forces, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it does, of course, create additional risks, or can create additional risks for civilians on the ground, especially when those forces are rapidly depleted, as I know Sahr has studied a lot, especially in the battle for Mosul. And so I do think there are some other lessons to be drawn about the political factors that affected the military campaign that may have less to do with the transfer of skills and lessons than they do about kind of what we may have forgotten in terms of the full range of interest that can be served by better protecting civilians in a campaign like that. We should really think about as a country, why it was so easy to learn those lessons.
So one of the things that we observed in that region when Russia moved in to fight in support of the Assad regime was a fairly pronounced and consistent pattern on the part of Russian forces of disregard for civilian casualties in their employment of weapons. There were a couple of marquee precision-guided munition strikes, including the cruise missiles launched from the Caspian Sea. But then there were a number of other strikes where it appeared that they either were operating without regard for, or at times, as in the case of some hospital strikes, perhaps even deliberately targeting targets that had a high impact on civilians and may have had a protected status under international law. Do the same rules not apply to them when they're operating in support of a government or they're fighting there? Because we've seen similar patterns in Ukraine. And if the rules do apply, how do the rules have meaning if we can't hold them accountable?
IHL is applicable to all parties to a conflict, irrespective of state or non-state actors. And I think, what we see a consistent failure is the adherence to core principles of IHL and holding militaries and armed actors accountable. And, Russia, yes, we saw how Russia prosecuted the war in Syria. And when the invasion of Ukraine happened, we're seeing a similar playbook being carried out. And, Russia is a member of the UN Security Council. States are encouraged to adhere to IHL. It's not an choose-your-own-adventure approach, irrespective of whether it's an existential threat or crisis for any state. Even in the context of Ukraine is defending its own territory. It still has to adhere to IHL in defending its territory and its citizens. And I think in this context, it is one of those consistent challenges. And I think Dan very eloquently said earlier, democracies and the role that, and maybe in a vibrant, more civil society, there can be more influence that citizens of a country can have on its own government and military to change its policies and practices. And, we would hope that Russian citizens would encourage their military. The Russian parents should encourage the military, that their soldiers are fighting lawfully and ethically. And, what sort of space there is for the media and civil society in Russia to question and challenge how the war is being prosecuted, because everybody is watching how, we have a live feed on what's happening in Ukraine consistently. So, everybody's watching. And I think in any state or any armed actor, their reputation, their standing in the world is judged when wars are being conducted. So it is. I think more needs to be done to encourage adherence to IHL and to include it into doctrine and training. And I think, we have to be sort of creative in how we encourage that to happen.
I will say, first of all, I will not incur the wrath of your listenership and the gods on high by drawing any equivalence between parties to conflicts. But I will say that there is before us an opportunity to demonstrate affirmatively a commitment to accountability, to draw those distinctions between states that seek not only legitimacy for their operations, but legitimacy for government itself. And I think we're at a point now in the world where those kinds of expressions of affirmative commitment to hold government accountable, to have government hold itself accountable, even when the claims on accountability by those who are seeking it are weaker, in places where they're not your citizens, but nonetheless you've affected their lives, or they don't hold a lot of power as a political constituency. Those are the times when countries that really want to step up and say, look, our commitment to accountability is a defining characteristic of our brand of politics. That's something that's an opportunity that could be seized readily upon right now.
So accountability for violations of the law of armed conflict, especially as it relates to a failure to protect civilians or to, in some cases, intentionally targeting civilians, this accountability accrues not only to states or to governments, but also to individuals. And I think there is something of a misperception that this accountability of individuals occurs almost exclusively in an international setting. The model of the Nuremberg tribunals is in many people's mind, and there's certainly been controversy surrounding the International Criminal Court and the United States' position on that. I'm wondering if you could outline how it is that individuals are held accountable for violations of the law of armed conflict as it relates to these grave breaches involving a failure to protect or an intentional choice to target civilians.
Dan, go for it. I think it's a great way to plug your accountability report.
Well, I'll preface by saying that between us, among us, I'm the only non-lawyer, I think. But as a matter of speaking in generalities, I mean, states are responsible for the conduct of the forces that fight for them. And when a state has signed up to abide by a treaty or is obliged to abide by customary international law, then the state itself is responsible for ensuring that its forces and the individuals that serve within those forces, are compliant. Beyond that, when something rises to the level of individual criminal liability, the system is developed really to ensure that the state itself has the systems in place to investigate and to hold to account individuals for their criminal conduct. And we've actually seen this work, with variable success, but we've seen it work within the United States when individuals have, basically conducted or been involved in, egregious war crimes. And there are a number of cases that we could talk about. We could talk about the Bales case and any number of other ones. The U.S. military has referred those cases to a competent criminal investigative authority, which has taken them up and investigated and prosecuted and put those people behind bars. And I think what gets lost sometimes in the conversation about internationalizing the criminal conduct of individuals in the armed forces is that the best protection that the United States has against submitting its own forces and its personnel to the International Criminal Court or any other extraterritorial criminal jurisdiction is actually making sure that it has very strong systems of military justice domestically, which traditionally we have. And I think the biggest threat to that claim is actually when we start to seek relief of that accountability, when we start to actually pursue amnesties for people who have been prosecuted and in fact convicted of war crimes. I think that's a real threat to the system and possibly something that I think could cause pretty significant harm. I just want to elaborate for 1 second, though, because there's probably 20,000 people listening to this podcast who are experts in international law and theories of state responsibility, who can talk about accountability in the legal perspective. One thing we're trying to do at Civic is to acknowledge the importance that the law plays in serving the purpose of accountability, but also to look at other ways that states can and should hold themselves accountable for harm to civilians in war. And when you break apart the concept of accountability, you can kind of discover other ways that the United States and any other country really needs to hold itself accountable, both by conceding that the harm was caused by its own forces in an act of acknowledgement, by expressing contrition when things actually take place, by doing what it can to provide remedy or amends to those that have been harmed, and really making sure that experience of accountability, those perceptions of accountability, are just as important as the procedural and kind of legalistic approaches we take to accountability. And I think that gets lost sometimes. And the last element of that I really don't want to get lost is the feature and theories of public accountability that speaks to non-repetition. And I think that's one of the other most important things is when you see patterns of conduct where civilians are killed over and over and over again, it kind of betrays a kind of intent. And when states instead take a look at patterns of harm and say, we identify a problem here and we want to do something differently to reduce that over time or to eliminate the possibility that will happen again in the future, that's holding the state's military to account. That's being accountable.
Yeah, that's. I would first actually say that you and I are in the same boat on not being a lawyer. So we have the lawyer outnumbered in this particular podcast. But it's actually a terrific segue to the next thing I wanted to ask about, which is we've been talking about some fairly bleak and serious stuff in terms of widespread violations, instances when harm to civilians has been extreme and severe. But you actually identify several best practices in the article that can help to mitigate this type of harm. And I'm wondering if you guys could discuss what those are and maybe briefly why they work.
We have been at Civic trying to, as part of our work, we talk to civilians, we speak to armed actors on the ground. We try to learn from all sides about what is effective, what are some good practices militaries have enacted, and whether when they've been implemented properly, whether there's been a reduction in civilian harm, and why it's important to share these good practices. So one of the things we have been encouraging militaries to adapt and plan is to have civilian protection integrated into commander's intent. So it's envisioned into operation planning and necessary resources. And so the commander has intended that protection of civilians is important. That will drive in the following resources. So it's not seen as a one-off, something that the civil affairs guy is going or woman is going to do. Second, we have found that population-centric analysis that feeds into the intelligence preparation phase of the operations, and this is an ongoing analysis, does provide better information to the commander, to the operational person on the ground, to see what the risk, where civilians present, how you would facilitate their movement, voluntary movement, how would you facilitate humanitarian assistance, how the presence of civilians or knowing where key infrastructure that civilians rely on for their survival, and the essential services such as water treatment facilities, power plants, etc., where they're located, so that you can, and if they're in proximity to military objectives, you can actually design and use the right munitions to minimize the impact on and the disruption to civilians and the reliance on the essential services. So we found that as very important. Third, reflecting protection of civilians and civilian harm mitigation into doctrine and training, also reflecting on operational tactical challenges is seen as a good practice, because it's about preparing and planning, and you're really preparing the soldiers for the challenges of fighting for the presence of civilians. And I think some of these are really important. We've also seen studying adversary tactics that put civilians at risk, and then undertaking mitigation measures has been successful. And then also even, growing emerging technologies. There's been growing trend of using cyber, and thankfully we've not seen some major cyber attacks that have completely disrupted power grids or energy or hospital usage, but still what can be done to build resiliency of infrastructure from these cyber attacks, I think are really important. So again, some of these things have come out of studying past operations, looking at past weapons effects, etc., so that you can better inform and enact training, policies, tactics, guidance. Because again, wars are happening where civilians are present. Gone are the days where there are two sides facing each other and there are no civilians present. So I think some of these, and there's a whole slew of things that we have sort of identified and learning from various militaries. And we have actually just published a primer on civilian harm mitigation and urban operations that reflect some of the learnings on good practices before, during, and after operations, which is also available on our website. And we mentioned some of those in the article.
So you mentioned briefly emerging technologies, and that brings to mind some trends that many experts are projecting for warfare. And two trends that seem to be fairly consistently identified is that war is increasingly going to be fought in cities and urban areas, and that war is increasingly going to involve automation of decisions about the use of force. And I'm curious how you see either or both of these trends affecting the question of civilian casualty mitigation, especially as they intersect.
Yes, the urbanization trends of the world indicate, again, now in the future, wars will be fought and any violence will take place in a populated setting. And so the emerging technologies, and there's a lot of data to analyze. So I think sometimes there could be usage of artificial intelligence, or some of these things could be useful to do analysis if you put in the right inputs and the algorithms to better analyze population trends, population presence, to see where protected infrastructure is, and you can program the analysis of the data in such way, provided that the inputs are accurate, right? You want to be speaking to the urban experts and the engineer from that area when you're doing this kind of analysis that feeds into the algorithm, so your artificial intelligence can help you better get intelligence preparation for the battlefield. But of course, end of the day, the decision is being made by a commander. And I think, it's not like the commander is going to say, oh, yes, the algorithm told me to do X. So we hopefully are not going to get to that place but so therefore there has to be checks and balances in the system that I think technology can enhance information analysis, but how you program it and what measures you put into place that the human, that the in the feedback loop, and there's always a human in the loop when it comes to decision making on the final decision to use force. And I think it's really important that human loop it remains a critical part of the decision making in any targeting operations.
Dan, any thoughts on this one?
I mean, Sahr has definitely done the vast majority of work within Civic on the prospect and consequences of the proliferation of urban warfare. And we're only now, I think, starting to understand the potential consequences of the emergence and application of new technologies. I think we're wise to look closely at the full range of consequences of emerging technology and not to accept, on the one hand, the kind of benign framing that's often associated with the use of automation, for example, or the use of AI and kind of making things more discerning or precise. Just as we should have been skeptical about, the benign association with, the precision of drone technology with the conduct of warfare. I mean, there are always good reasons to be, to be critical in our evaluation of whether or not, any application of technology can be purely benign. And at the same time, to be equally curious about whether or not any, form of technology is inherently, an evil thing. I think one of the things we need to focus on, even as we focus on the technology, is also the human, behind the decisions and behind the forces that are doing the fighting. And when it comes to the United States military, I think there are a full range of issues that we need to be thinking about and talking about as a new generation of fighters is going into the force, and as new decisions are being made about decentralizing the way decisions are made and the way that operations are being planned. We're suddenly going to have a full cadre of U.S. forces who have not served in either campaigns in Afghanistan or Iraq. And I think the human judgment that came out of experiences in both of those campaigns, for better or worse, is something that we need to consider when it comes to the way we think about civilians on the battlefield. I also think, again, this gets a little bit away from Civic's core focus, but we have learned a lot about the effect of the way we perceive people in other countries on how much, death and destruction we're willing to tolerate as a country. And so I think, Civic is well positioned in place to take what we've learned on the technical side when it comes to adapting operations and thinking about technology and looking at ways that, armed forces who are interested in doing so can really prevent, minimize and address civilian harm. We also need to think about the political and cultural factors that are playing into our national tolerance for these things, and maybe not put so much squarely on the shoulders of our fighting forces when it comes to preserving our kind of national moral integrity. And I think that's another point that we try to make in the article, because I think sometimes we unfairly ask the military to do so much, and really we need to kind of recenter our focus a little bit on ourselves and ask ourselves, why is it this way?
Yeah, your comments actually remind me a bit of Samuel Moyn's argument in Humane that we have created the ability to apply force with great precision, but at the same time, by doing so, we have created the perception that the consequences of applying force are minimal enough that we can do it with a much lower threshold of certainty than we would do if the force was likely to have greater effect. And so it's this sort of perverse effect that we may have made ourselves more willing to use force in ways that will potentially harm those who are innocent than we would be if we had a sense that the harm was more dramatic. We're coming up on the end of our time, and I'd just like to give each of you a minute to sort of give any concluding thoughts that you might have or any points you want to draw out from the article that we haven't brought out in discussion as yet. And Sahr, why don't we start with you?
So one of the things we say actually in our conclusion is, and I think it's sort of Dan also alluded to, is, who's responsible? Again, there's a lot of emphasis that is paid on military leaders, but, civilian leaders are the ones who, at least in democracies and in the U.S., make the decision to go to war and engage. And the civilian oversight is really important. And it's interesting. I mean, in the U.S. context, at least now, there is more requests and concerns being raised by Congress on civilian harm issues attributed to the U.S. The earlier this year, Defense Secretary Lloyd directed the Department of Defense to develop a civilian harm mitigation response and action plan, with also a recommendation to set up a center of excellence on civilian harm mitigation response. We haven't seen the details of it, but a lot of NGOs, including Civic, have been providing recommendations and feeding into it. So, it's great to see these reforms being put out there. We'll have to see what they actually say and how they implement it, because I think it's at least it's a positive indicator, at least on certain aspects of some of the learnings that have come from the prosecution of the war against Islamic State is led to enactment of this new DoD directive. At the same time, there's also, and I think there needs to be more done on, if we think about, current and future wars are being fought in urban areas. And I think there's still a gap and not full understanding of the complexities and challenges of conducting wars in urban areas. And I know General Milley, in his address in West Point in May, said that, but we haven't seen any dedicated training schools on urban war and really preparing the military on the challenges, conducting operations against a peer and near peer in urban war, and what are going to be all the civilian protection challenges in that. I was out in California in July with the 40th Infantry Division, California's National Guard, which is for the second time they hosted this urban planners course, which is one of the only sort of urban planners course that the U.S., and it's the National Guard who's doing this. So it's not even the full U.S. military. And I think this is, again, we go back to the premise of our initial article is now is the time and opportunity to learn and prepare and to fully embrace all of the challenges. And as you said, again, wars are going to be fought in urban areas. So what is the U.S. and its allies really understanding the challenges for conducting operations in urban areas against a peer or near peer, and how to mitigate the consequences for civilians. So I think there's a whole area that needs more learning and sharing and preparedness that we hope that sort of this article also, readers and military practitioners and policymakers take that into account going forward.
Dan?
Yeah, Doyle, and thanks again so much for having us. And Sahr, it's just been a pleasure chit-chatting with you in this format. It's always really fun for me. We don't get to do it often enough, and you can cut this out of the podcast, but it's genuine reflection. First of all, I think I'd like to conclude with a couple of observations. First of all, I do think it's important for Civic to acknowledge that, we wrote this piece really as an attempt to kind of appeal to the sensibilities and rationale of a government and its fighting forces, in this case, the United States government and the U.S. military. But ultimately, the source of our inspiration really comes from what our organization and people like Sahr have seen for too many years, which is the effect that conflict is having on real human beings. And we forget that sometimes. We're trying to convince militaries that, hey, this is in your interest and it's in the interest of your country. But we also never want to forget that what we're really trying to do is to make sure that more people, live and more children live, and more children lose fewer limbs, and schools remain open, and places of business. That's better for the United States. It's also much better for those people, of course, the countries they live in, and really the world that we live in the future. And we talked a little bit about changes in warfighting and kind of the dimensions of conflict. I also think there are a full range of troubling global phenomena right now that suggests that we are going to be dealing with perhaps more and not less acute forms of violence, to include conflict. And so it's really important for those countries that have the ability to do so to make sure that violence is prevented if possible, but also that its effects are not so devastating that they really change the world fundamentally, in which we've seen this twice now in the last century, and hopefully won't be seeing it again. And that's what I think we're trying to emphasize in the piece. So first and foremost, our concern is really about the civilians themselves. But
thank you so much, Doyle.
Absolutely, I'm grateful to you, Dan, for staying up late in The Hague to join us. And our guests this week have been Sahr Muhammedally and Dan Mahanty. both at the Center of Civilians in Conflict. They are the authors in Volume 5, Issue 3 of The Human Factor, The Enduring Relevance of Protecting Civilians in Conflict. If you haven't yet read the article, I would commend it to you. Unfortunately, it's an article whose relevance, I fear, is going to only grow more important as the days go on. So, Sahr, Dan, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.